The cathedral bells rang out across the castle courtyard as dawn broke over medieval Europe, but the sounds that echoed from the royal chambers above weren't prayers, they were the orchestrated moans and gasps of a wedding night performance that an entire court was waiting to witness. Behind heavy oak doors adorned with religious symbols, a young bride and groom weren't just consummating their marriage, they were performing the opening act in a sexual theater that would define medieval power, politics, and piety for the next 1,000 years. This wasn't romance. This wasn't even privacy. In medieval courts, sexuality became the ultimate public spectacle, where the most intimate human acts were transformed into political ceremonies, religious rituals, and social entertainment that would make modern reality television seem quaint by comparison. From the bedding ceremonies that required dozens of witnesses to the courtly love affairs that were choreographed like military campaigns, medieval nobility didn't just have sex, they performed it, documented it, and turned it into the foundation of political power. These weren't random acts of exhibitionism but carefully orchestrated displays that used human sexuality to demonstrate divine authority, political legitimacy, and social hierarchy. Before we pull back the velvet curtains on this world of sanctified scandal, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into history's most forbidden chambers. Now prepare yourself, the torches are lit, the courtiers are gathering, and behind these castle walls, medieval Europe is about to reveal how it transformed the marriage bed into a stage for the most public of private performances. The sacred theater of the wedding night. Medieval marriage wasn't a private affair between two people, it was a public contract that required witnesses, documentation, and most shocking of all, verification that the union had been physically consummated. The bedding ceremony, known as the benedictio thalami, transformed the wedding night into a theatrical performance where the bride and groom's most intimate moments became public spectacle. The ceremony began with the formal procession to the marriage chamber, led by priests carrying blessed candles and holy water. The bride and groom were escorted by dozens of nobles, church officials, and family members who would serve as witnesses to the sacred union. But these weren't just ceremonial escorts, they were the audience for a performance that was about to unfold. Medieval law required that marriages be consummated to be considered valid, but the nobility took this requirement to extremes that transformed legal necessity into elaborate ritual. The witnesses didn't just escort the couple to their chamber, they remained present during the actual consummation, their presence serving as legal proof that the marriage had been properly completed. The bride and groom were ceremonially undressed by their attendants, each piece of clothing removed with ritualistic precision while prayers were recited and blessings pronounced. This wasn't just preparation for intimacy, it was the systematic stripping away of their individual identities to create a new political and social entity through their physical union. The marriage bed itself was a stage set designed for maximum symbolic impact. Blessed by priests, decorated with religious symbols, and positioned to provide optimal viewing for the assembled witnesses, it served as both altar and theater for the sacred drama about to unfold. Every aspect of the chamber was carefully arranged to emphasize the public nature of what was traditionally considered private. The actual consummation was performed with the witnesses present, their role extending beyond mere observation to active participation in verifying the completion of the sexual act. They would examine the bed sheets for evidence of the bride's virginity, document any difficulties or complications, and provide sworn testimony that the union had been properly completed according to both religious and legal requirements. The psychological pressure on the bride and groom must have been enormous. They were expected to perform the most intimate of human acts while being watched by dozens of strangers, their sexual performance serving as proof of their worthiness for marriage and their ability to produce the heirs that would continue their family lines. The bedding ceremony also served political functions that went far beyond simple marriage validation. The witnesses represented different factions and interests within the court, their presence ensuring that no one could later claim the marriage was invalid or that the succession rights of any children were questionable. Sexual performance became political performance. The documentation of these ceremonies was extensive and detailed. Court scribes would record not just the fact that consummation had occurred but specific details about the process, the participants' behavior, and any unusual circumstances that might affect the legal validity of the union. These records served as legal documents that could be referenced in future disputes about inheritance or succession. The religious justification for these public consummations was elaborate and sophisticated. Medieval theologians argued that marriage was a sacrament that required witnesses just like baptism or communion, and that the sexual union of husband and wife was a sacred act that reflected the mystical union between Christ and the Church. Privacy, they claimed, would diminish the spiritual significance of the act. The social pressure to perform adequately during these public consummations created a culture of sexual anxiety that affected entire generations of medieval nobility. Young people grew up knowing that their wedding night would be a public performance, their sexual competence evaluated by an audience of their peers and superiors. Some couples attempted to circumvent the public nature of these ceremonies through various strategies, consuming alcohol to reduce inhibitions, using aphrodisiacs to enhance performance, or even arranging for substitutes to take their place in the marriage bed. But such deceptions were risky, as discovery could invalidate the marriage and destroy the political alliances it was meant to create. The courtly love spectacle. Medieval courts didn't just publicize marriage, they turned extramarital desire into elaborate entertainment that combined romance, politics, and sexual tension into a form of theater that captivated audiences while serving the political needs of the nobility. Courtly love wasn't just poetry and songs, it was a systematic performance of desire that turned adultery into art and sexual frustration into political power. The rules of courtly love were as complex as any legal code, governing everything from how lovers could look at each other to what gifts they could exchange and how they could express their passion without crossing lines that would trigger social or political consequences. These weren't spontaneous romances but carefully choreographed performances that served multiple audiences simultaneously. The typical courtly love affair began with the selection of an unattainable object of desire, usually a married noblewoman of higher social rank than her would-be lover. This wasn't accidental but strategic, as the impossibility of consummation created a state of perpetual tension that could be sustained indefinitely without the messy complications that actual sexual relationships might create. The performance of courtly love required elaborate displays of devotion that were designed to be witnessed and appreciated by the entire court. Knights would compose poetry, commission art, and stage elaborate gestures of devotion that demonstrated their passion while maintaining the pretense that their love was pure and spiritual rather than physical and carnal. The lady who served as the object of courtly love was expected to respond with carefully calibrated encouragement that maintained her admirer's devotion without compromising her reputation or marriage. This required sophisticated acting skills, as she had to appear moved by his devotion while remaining appropriately distant and unattainable. The audiences for these courtly love performances weren't passive observers but active participants who judged the quality of the performances, gossiped about the sincerity of the emotions displayed, and used their observations to advance their own political and social agendas. Every gesture, every poem, every meaningful glance was analyzed and interpreted by dozens of courtiers. The sexual tension that courtly love created was deliberately maintained at a fever pitch through a system of rules that allowed for increasingly intimate expressions of devotion while prohibiting actual sexual consummation. Lovers could exchange increasingly personal gifts, engage in more intimate conversations, and even share physical contact that stopped just short of sexual activity. The political functions of courtly love were as important as its entertainment value. These performances allowed nobles to form alliances, test loyalties, and negotiate power relationships through the seemingly innocent medium of romantic poetry and chivalric devotion. A knight's choice of lady to court could signal political allegiances, while a lady's response could indicate her family's position on various court issues. The psychological impact of courtly love on medieval sexuality was profound. It created a culture where sexual desire was expected to be performed rather than simply felt, where the expression of passion required artistic skill as much as emotional authenticity, and where the most intense relationships were those that remained unconsummated. The literature that emerged from courtly love culture provides detailed documentation of these sexual performances. Poems, songs, and stories describe specific techniques for expressing desire, maintaining tension, and navigating the complex social rules that governed romantic relationships in medieval courts. The religious implications of courtly love were complex and contradictory. While the Church officially condemned adultery and extramarital desire, many theologians found ways to justify courtly love as a form of spiritual discipline that elevated human passion toward divine love. The suffering caused by unattainable desire was presented as a form of religious penance. The economic aspects of courtly love were significant, as these performances required substantial investments in clothing, jewelry, art, and entertainment. Knights would bankrupt themselves commissioning poems, purchasing gifts, and staging elaborate displays of devotion, treating their romantic performances as investments in their social and political advancement. The royal mistress system. Medieval kings didn't just take mistresses, they institutionalized adultery, creating official positions for their extramarital partners that transformed sexual relationships into government offices complete with salaries, titles, and political responsibilities. The royal mistress system turned infidelity into statecraft and sexual performance into public service. The position of royal mistress was as formal and regulated as any other court office. Mistresses received official titles, lived in designated quarters within the royal palace, and maintained households that were funded by the royal treasury. Their sexual services to the king were treated as official duties that required the same level of commitment and performance as any other government position. The selection process for royal mistresses was as careful and political as the appointment of ministers or generals. Candidates were evaluated not just for their physical attractiveness but for their intelligence, discretion, family connections, and ability to navigate the complex politics of court life. Beauty alone was insufficient. Royal mistresses needed to be skilled politicians who could advance their patrons' interests while managing their own survival in a dangerous environment. The public nature of these relationships was striking. Royal mistresses appeared at court functions, participated in state ceremonies, and were acknowledged by foreign diplomats as official representatives of the king's household. Their presence wasn't hidden or apologized for but celebrated as evidence of the king's virility and power. The political functions of royal mistresses extended far beyond sexual gratification. They served as informal advisors, intelligence gatherers, and diplomatic channels who could communicate with foreign courts through networks that were unavailable to official ambassadors. Their intimate access to the king made them valuable allies for nobles seeking royal favor and dangerous enemies for those who opposed them. The economic impact of the royal mistress system was substantial. These women controlled significant financial resources, maintained large households, and influenced the distribution of royal patronage in ways that affected the entire kingdom's economy. Some royal mistresses accumulated wealth and power that rivaled that of legitimate queens. The documentation of royal mistress relationships was extensive and public. Court records detailed their appointments, salaries, and official duties, while chroniclers wrote about their influence on policy and their relationships with other court figures. These weren't secret affairs but public institutions that were as well documented as any other aspect of government. The religious justification for the royal mistress system was complex and often contradictory. While the Church officially condemned adultery, many theologians found ways to rationalize royal infidelity as a necessary evil that prevented worse sins or as a form of political necessity that served the greater good of the kingdom. The social hierarchy within the royal mistress system was as complex as any other court institution. Senior mistresses held higher rank than junior ones, with elaborate protocols governing their interactions with each other and with other court officials. Competition between mistresses could influence policy and create political factions that affected the entire kingdom. The training and education of royal mistresses was sophisticated and comprehensive. They needed to master not just sexual techniques but also languages, literature, music, and politics. Many received educations that were superior to those available to most noblewomen, as their success depended on their ability to serve as intellectual companions as well as sexual partners. The retirement and pension systems for royal mistresses were well established and generous. Former mistresses often received titles, estates, and ongoing financial support that ensured their loyalty and discretion after their sexual relationships with the king had ended. Some parlayed their court experience into marriages with powerful nobles or positions as advisors to other royals. The international aspects of the royal mistress system created diplomatic opportunities and complications that affected relations between kingdoms. Foreign courts would sometimes attempt to influence policy by providing attractive candidates for royal mistress positions, while the treatment of foreign-born mistresses could become matters of international concern. The Church's sexual surveillance state. The medieval Catholic Church didn't just preach about sexual morality, it created the world's first comprehensive surveillance system dedicated to monitoring, documenting, and controlling human sexuality in ways that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Through confession, penance, and ecclesiastical courts, the Church transformed private sexual behavior into public knowledge that could be used for political and social control. The sacrament of confession required Catholics to reveal their most intimate sexual thoughts and behaviors to priests who were trained to extract detailed information about their parishioners' private lives. This wasn't just spiritual counseling but systematic intelligence gathering that created vast databases of sexual information that the Church could use to influence politics and society. Medieval confession manuals provided priests with detailed questionnaires designed to uncover every aspect of their parishioners' sexual behavior. These guides included hundreds of specific questions about sexual positions, frequency of intercourse, extramarital relationships, and even sexual thoughts and fantasies. No aspect of human sexuality was considered too private for ecclesiastical investigation. The information gathered through confession was documented and preserved in church records that created comprehensive profiles of individuals' sexual behavior over their entire lifetimes. These records were used to evaluate candidates for political positions, assess the suitability of proposed marriages, and identify potential sources of scandal that could be used for political leverage. The Church's sexual surveillance extended beyond individual confession to include community monitoring systems that encouraged Catholics to report on their neighbors' sexual behavior. This created a culture of sexual paranoia where private behavior was constantly subject to public scrutiny and where sexual conformity was enforced through peer pressure and fear of exposure. Ecclesiastical courts had jurisdiction over all matters related to marriage and sexuality, giving the Church legal authority to investigate, prosecute, and punish sexual behavior that violated religious law. These courts conducted detailed investigations that included physical examinations, witness testimony, and documentary evidence that created public records of the most private human behaviors. The penalties imposed by ecclesiastical courts for sexual violations were designed to be as public and humiliating as possible. Offenders were required to perform public penance that included detailed confessions of their sexual sins, physical punishments that were witnessed by their communities, and ongoing supervision that ensured their continued sexual compliance. The Church's control over marriage gave it enormous power to influence political alliances and social relationships through its ability to approve or deny marriages, declare existing marriages invalid, and impose conditions on sexual relationships that affected inheritance and succession rights. The training of priests in sexual surveillance techniques was extensive and sophisticated. Seminary education included detailed instruction in human sexuality, interrogation techniques, and the legal procedures necessary to prosecute sexual crimes. Priests were essentially trained as sexual investigators whose primary mission was gathering intelligence about their parishioners' private lives. The international nature of the Church's sexual surveillance system created opportunities for political espionage and influence that extended across national boundaries. Information gathered in one kingdom could be shared with church officials in other countries, creating intelligence networks that were independent of secular political authorities. The psychological impact of constant sexual surveillance on medieval society was profound. People lived with the knowledge that their most intimate behaviors were subject to investigation and punishment, creating a culture of sexual anxiety and conformity that affected every aspect of human relationships. The economic aspects of the Church's sexual surveillance were significant, as the fees, fines, and donations generated by sexual prosecutions provided substantial revenue for ecclesiastical institutions. Sexual sin became a profitable business that gave the Church financial incentives to maintain and expand its surveillance activities. The aristocratic breeding programs. Medieval nobility didn't just arrange marriages, they operated systematic breeding programs that treated human reproduction like livestock management, with detailed records, genetic planning, and sexual performance monitoring that would make modern animal breeders proud. These weren't romantic unions but calculated genetic experiments designed to produce superior offspring who could maintain and expand aristocratic power. The selection of breeding partners involved extensive research into family histories, genetic traits, and reproductive capabilities that was conducted with scientific precision. Noble families maintained detailed genealogical records that tracked not just lineage but also physical characteristics, intellectual abilities, and reproductive success across multiple generations. The negotiation of marriage contracts included specific provisions about sexual performance and reproductive obligations that were as detailed as any commercial agreement. These contracts specified the frequency of sexual intercourse required, the conditions under which marriages could be dissolved for reproductive failure, and the penalties for failing to produce the required number of male heirs. The monitoring of aristocratic sexual activity was constant and intrusive. Newly married couples were supervised by experienced matrons who tracked menstrual cycles, documented sexual encounters, and provided detailed reports on reproductive progress to the families involved. Privacy was sacrificed to ensure optimal breeding outcomes. The medical support provided for aristocratic reproduction was extensive and sophisticated. Noble families employed physicians who specialized in fertility enhancement, midwives who were trained in genetic selection, and herbalists who provided drugs designed to increase the likelihood of male offspring or improve the physical characteristics of children. The documentation of aristocratic breeding programs was meticulous and comprehensive. Family records included detailed information about sexual performance, fertility rates, pregnancy outcomes, and the physical and intellectual characteristics of offspring. These records were used to make future breeding decisions and to evaluate the success of different genetic combinations. The international aspects of aristocratic breeding created marriage markets that spanned continents. Noble families would send representatives across Europe to evaluate potential breeding partners, negotiate genetic exchanges, and arrange marriages that would optimize the genetic potential of their offspring. The economic investments in aristocratic breeding were enormous. Families would spend fortunes on medical care, genetic research, and marriage negotiations that were designed to ensure optimal reproductive outcomes. The production of superior offspring was treated as the most important investment a noble family could make. The religious justification for aristocratic breeding programs was complex and often contradictory. While the Church officially promoted marriage for love and spiritual companionship, it also supported the idea that noble families had special obligations to produce superior offspring who could serve God and society more effectively. The psychological pressure on aristocratic couples to perform sexually and reproductively was intense. Their sexual relationships were constantly monitored and evaluated, with their worth as individuals tied directly to their ability to produce the children that their families and society demanded. The scientific methods used in aristocratic breeding programs were surprisingly advanced for their time. Noble families employed primitive forms of genetic analysis, statistical tracking of reproductive success, and experimental approaches to fertility enhancement that wouldn't be out of place in modern reproductive medicine. The social consequences of aristocratic breeding programs affected the entire structure of medieval society. The emphasis on genetic superiority reinforced class distinctions, justified social inequality, and created a culture where human worth was determined by breeding potential rather than individual merit or achievement. The spectacle of royal virginity. Medieval courts didn't just value female virginity, they turned it into public theater, with elaborate ceremonies, medical examinations, and legal procedures that transformed the most private aspects of women's bodies into matters of state concern. The verification and preservation of royal virginity became a public obsession that affected international relations and political stability. The examination of royal brides was conducted by teams of physicians, midwives, and noble matrons who were required to provide sworn testimony about the physical evidence of virginity. These examinations were as formal and documented as any other state ceremony, with detailed records that could be referenced in future disputes about legitimacy or succession. The public nature of virginity verification extended beyond simple medical examination to include elaborate ceremonies that celebrated and displayed the bride's purity. These events were attended by hundreds of courtiers and foreign dignitaries who served as witnesses to the bride's suitability for royal marriage. The political implications of royal virginity were enormous, as the legitimacy of future heirs depended on absolute certainty that the queen had been pure at the time of marriage. Any doubt about a royal bride's virginity could trigger succession crises, international conflicts, and civil wars that could destroy kingdoms. The medical techniques used to verify virginity were primitive and often harmful, but they were treated with the same seriousness as any other medical procedure. Physicians developed elaborate theories about the physical signs of virginity and created detailed protocols for conducting examinations that would provide legally acceptable evidence. The psychological impact on royal brides of having their virginity publicly examined and verified must have been traumatic. These young women, often teenagers, were subjected to intimate physical examinations by strangers while knowing that their entire future depended on the results of these invasive procedures. The international aspects of royal virginity verification created diplomatic protocols that governed how foreign brides would be examined and certified. These procedures had to satisfy the requirements of multiple kingdoms while respecting the sensitivities of different cultural and religious traditions. The documentation of royal virginity examinations was extensive and permanent. The records of these examinations were preserved in state archives and could be referenced decades later in disputes about succession or legitimacy. A woman's virginity became a matter of permanent public record. The religious significance of royal virginity was emphasized through elaborate ceremonies that combined medical examination with spiritual blessing. Priests would bless the examination procedures and interpret the results as evidence of divine favor or disapproval of the proposed marriage. The economic value of royal virginity was substantial, as marriages could be dissolved and dowries forfeited if brides were found to be impure. The financial stakes created incentives for deception and fraud that led to increasingly sophisticated examination techniques and legal procedures. The social pressure on noble families to preserve their daughters' virginity was intense and constant. Young women were subjected to constant surveillance and physical restrictions that were designed to ensure their purity would be unquestionable when the time came for marriage negotiations. The technological innovations that emerged from royal virginity verification included improved medical instruments, more sophisticated examination techniques, and better documentation methods that influenced the development of medieval medicine and legal procedure. The papal marriage tribunals. The Vatican didn't just regulate marriage, it operated elaborate judicial systems that investigated the most intimate details of royal sexual relationships, with papal tribunals that could dissolve kingdoms and reshape European politics through their decisions about the validity of royal marriages and the legitimacy of royal offspring. The papal marriage tribunals had jurisdiction over all Christian marriages, but their most important work involved investigating royal unions that had political implications for the entire Christian world. These investigations were as thorough and intrusive as any modern legal proceeding, with teams of investigators gathering evidence about every aspect of royal sexual relationships. The grounds for annulling royal marriages were numerous and complex, ranging from consanguinity and impotence to fraud and coercion. Each ground required different types of evidence and investigation, creating a legal system that could find reasons to dissolve almost any marriage if political circumstances required it. The investigation procedures used by papal tribunals were sophisticated and comprehensive. Investigators would interview dozens of witnesses, examine physical evidence, and conduct medical examinations that provided detailed documentation of royal sexual behavior and reproductive capacity. The political implications of papal marriage decisions were enormous, as the legitimacy of royal offspring and the validity of succession claims depended on the Church's recognition of their parents' marriages. A papal annulment could delegitimize entire royal lines and trigger international conflicts. The documentation produced by papal marriage tribunals provides some of the most detailed evidence available about medieval royal sexuality. These records include intimate details about sexual performance, reproductive capacity, and marital relationships that were considered too sensitive for other forms of documentation. The international aspects of papal marriage tribunals created opportunities for political manipulation and influence that extended across national boundaries. Foreign kingdoms could petition the Vatican to investigate marriages that were politically inconvenient, while the Church could use its marriage jurisdiction to influence international relations. The economic impact of papal marriage decisions was substantial, as annulments could affect inheritance rights, dowry obligations, and international trade agreements that were tied to royal marriages. The Church's marriage jurisdiction gave it enormous economic power that could be used to influence secular politics. The religious justification for papal marriage tribunals was based on the Church's claim to exclusive jurisdiction over the sacrament of marriage. This theological position gave the Vatican legal authority that superseded secular law and created a parallel judicial system that could override royal authority. The psychological pressure on royal couples whose marriages were under papal investigation was intense. They were required to submit to intimate questioning and examination while knowing that their entire future depended on the tribunal's decision about the validity of their relationship. The legal innovations that emerged from papal marriage tribunals influenced the development of canon law and secular legal systems throughout Europe. The procedures and precedents established by these tribunals created legal frameworks that continued to influence marriage law for centuries. The corruption and political manipulation that sometimes affected papal marriage tribunals created scandals that damaged the Church's reputation and credibility. The perception that marriage decisions were influenced by political considerations rather than religious principles undermined the spiritual authority that justified the Church's jurisdiction over marriage. The courtly confession culture. Medieval courts didn't just practice Christianity, they turned religious confession into a form of entertainment and political intelligence gathering, with elaborate confession rituals that transformed private spiritual counseling into public theater where the most intimate secrets became court gossip and political ammunition. The practice of public confession in medieval courts went far beyond the private sacrament administered by priests. Nobles were expected to confess their sins publicly during court ceremonies, with their admissions of sexual misconduct serving as entertainment for their peers and information for their political rivals. The confession of sexual sins was particularly valued as court entertainment, with nobles competing to provide the most shocking and detailed accounts of their sexual adventures. These confessions weren't just spiritual exercises but performance art that demonstrated wit, courage, and sexual sophistication. The political uses of confession information were extensive and sophisticated. Court officials would use the sexual secrets revealed during confession to blackmail political opponents, influence policy decisions, and advance their own careers through the strategic use of compromising information. The religious justification for public confession was based on medieval theological concepts about the communal nature of sin and the need for public penance to restore social harmony. Private confession was considered insufficient for serious sins that affected the entire community. The documentation of court confessions was extensive and detailed. Scribes would record not just the fact that confession had occurred but specific details about the sins confessed and the penance imposed. These records became valuable political intelligence that could be used for years after the original confession. The psychological impact of public confession on medieval court culture was profound. Nobles lived with the knowledge that their most intimate secrets might become public entertainment, creating a culture of sexual anxiety and competitive exhibitionism that affected all court relationships. The social hierarchy that governed court confession reflected the broader power structures of medieval society. High-ranking nobles could confess minor sins for entertainment value, while lower-ranking courtiers were expected to reveal more serious and embarrassing secrets to maintain their position. The international aspects of court confession created opportunities for diplomatic intelligence gathering and political manipulation. Foreign visitors to medieval courts were often encouraged to participate in confession rituals that revealed information about their home country's politics and personalities. The economic aspects of court confession were significant, as the information revealed during these rituals could affect business relationships, marriage negotiations, and inheritance disputes. Sexual secrets became valuable commodities that could be traded for political and economic advantage. The literary and artistic impact of court confession culture was substantial, inspiring countless poems, songs, and stories that celebrated or satirized the practice of public sexual confession. This literature provides valuable documentation of medieval attitudes toward sexuality and privacy. The corruption and abuse that sometimes accompanied court confession practices created scandals that damaged both religious and secular authority. The perception that confession was being used for political manipulation rather than spiritual guidance undermined the credibility of both church and court. The Royal Pregnancy Watch. Medieval courts didn't just wait for royal babies, they turned pregnancy into a public spectacle with constant monitoring, medical supervision, and political maneuvering that transformed the most natural of human processes into matters of international concern. Every aspect of royal pregnancy became public knowledge, from conception to delivery. The confirmation of royal pregnancy required formal medical examination and official announcement that was as elaborate as any state ceremony. Teams of physicians and midwives would conduct examinations that were witnessed by court officials and documented in state records that became matters of permanent public record. The monitoring of royal pregnancy was constant and intrusive, with medical attendants tracking every aspect of the Queen's condition and behavior. Daily reports were prepared and distributed to court officials, foreign ambassadors, and family members who had political interests in the pregnancy's outcome. The political implications of royal pregnancy were enormous, as the sex and health of the expected child could affect succession rights, international alliances, and domestic stability. Every symptom and development was analyzed for its potential political significance by courtiers and foreign observers. The medical care provided during royal pregnancy was the most advanced available, with teams of specialists who were responsible for ensuring the health of both mother and child. These medical teams were as carefully selected and politically vetted as any other court officials. The religious aspects of royal pregnancy included elaborate blessing ceremonies, special prayers, and spiritual preparations that were designed to ensure divine favor for the birth. The Church played a major role in monitoring and supporting royal pregnancies through both spiritual and practical assistance. The documentation of royal pregnancy was extensive and detailed, with daily records that tracked everything from the Queen's appetite and sleep patterns to her emotional state and physical symptoms. These records were preserved in state archives and could be referenced in future disputes about succession or legitimacy. The international interest in royal pregnancy created diplomatic protocols that governed how foreign courts would be informed about pregnancy developments and birth outcomes. The birth of royal heirs was considered a matter of international concern that affected the balance of power throughout Europe. The economic impact of royal pregnancy was substantial, as the expected birth could affect currency values, trade relationships, and investment decisions throughout the kingdom and beyond. Financial markets would fluctuate based on news about royal pregnancy developments. The social pressure on royal women during pregnancy was intense and constant. They were expected to maintain perfect behavior and health while being constantly observed and evaluated by hundreds of courtiers and officials who had political interests in their pregnancy's outcome. The technological innovations that emerged from royal pregnancy care included improved medical instruments, better understanding of prenatal development, and more sophisticated monitoring techniques that influenced the development of medieval medicine. The psychological toll on royal women of having their pregnancies constantly monitored and politicized must have been enormous. They were required to endure the most intimate medical examinations while knowing that every aspect of their condition was being analyzed for political implications. The diplomatic marriage bed. Medieval royal marriages weren't just personal unions, they were international treaties negotiated in bedchambers, with sexual performance serving as diplomatic communication and marital relationships functioning as ongoing political negotiations that could determine the fate of nations. The negotiation of royal marriage contracts included detailed provisions about sexual obligations and reproductive requirements that were as specific as any commercial agreement. These contracts specified not just dowries and territorial exchanges but also the frequency of sexual intercourse required and the penalties for reproductive failure. The consummation of royal marriages was witnessed by representatives of both kingdoms who served as official observers to ensure that the political alliance had been properly sealed through physical union. These witnesses would provide sworn testimony that could be referenced in future disputes about the validity of the marriage or the legitimacy of offspring. The ongoing sexual relationship between royal spouses was monitored and documented by court officials who tracked everything from the frequency of intimate encounters to the emotional dynamics of the relationship. This information was used to assess the stability of the political alliance and to predict future developments. The political implications of royal sexual relationships extended far beyond simple reproduction to include the emotional bonds that could influence policy decisions and international relations. A loving royal marriage could strengthen alliances while marital discord could trigger diplomatic crises. The medical supervision of royal sexual relationships included regular examinations to assess reproductive health and fertility, with physicians providing detailed reports about the couple's sexual compatibility and reproductive prospects. This medical intelligence was considered as important as any other form of diplomatic information. The religious aspects of royal marriage included elaborate blessing ceremonies and ongoing spiritual supervision that was designed to ensure divine favor for the political alliance. The Church played a major role in monitoring and supporting royal marriages through both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. The documentation of royal sexual relationships was extensive and permanent, with detailed records that tracked everything from the timing of intimate encounters to the emotional dynamics of the relationship. These records were preserved in state archives and could be referenced decades later in diplomatic negotiations. The international protocols that governed royal marriage relationships created complex systems of communication and negotiation that extended far beyond the married couple to include their families, advisors, and political allies. Every aspect of the relationship had diplomatic implications that affected international relations. The economic impact of royal sexual relationships was substantial, as the stability of the marriage could affect trade relationships, currency values, and investment decisions throughout both kingdoms. Financial markets would fluctuate based on news about royal marital developments. The social pressure on royal couples to maintain successful sexual relationships was intense and constant. They were expected to produce heirs while maintaining emotional bonds that would support the political alliance, all while being constantly observed and evaluated by hundreds of courtiers and foreign observers. The psychological toll on royal couples of having their most intimate relationships constantly monitored and politicized must have been enormous. They were required to maintain loving marriages while knowing that every aspect of their relationship was being analyzed for political implications by people who had vested interests in their success or failure. The medieval sex manual industry. Medieval courts didn't just practice elaborate sexuality, they created a sophisticated literature industry dedicated to documenting, teaching, and refining sexual techniques that were considered essential knowledge for successful political and social advancement. These weren't crude pornographic texts but sophisticated instructional manuals that treated sexuality as a skill requiring education and practice. The production of medieval sex manuals was a serious literary enterprise that involved scholars, physicians, and court officials who were considered experts in human sexuality. These authors combined classical knowledge from Greek and Roman sources with contemporary medical understanding and practical experience to create comprehensive guides to sexual technique and performance. The content of medieval sex manuals was remarkably detailed and sophisticated, covering everything from basic anatomy and sexual positions to advanced techniques for enhancing pleasure and ensuring reproductive success. These texts included detailed illustrations, medical explanations, and practical advice that was designed to improve sexual performance and satisfaction. The distribution of medieval sex manuals was carefully controlled and politically sensitive. These texts were expensive to produce and were generally available only to wealthy nobles who could afford the cost and who had the social status necessary to access such sensitive material. Ownership of sex manuals was itself a mark of sophistication and political importance. The political uses of medieval sex manuals extended beyond simple education to include diplomatic gifts, political rewards, and tools for international influence. Rare or particularly sophisticated sex manuals were sometimes given as diplomatic presents that demonstrated the giver's sophistication and cultural advancement. The religious aspects of medieval sex manuals were complex and often contradictory. While the Church officially condemned many forms of sexual activity, some religious authorities recognized the importance of sexual education for married couples and provided theological justification for certain types of sexual instruction. The medical content of medieval sex manuals was surprisingly advanced, incorporating contemporary understanding of human anatomy, reproductive biology, and sexual psychology. These texts served as medical textbooks that influenced the development of medieval medicine and contributed to advances in understanding human sexuality. The international circulation of medieval sex manuals created opportunities for cultural exchange and intellectual development that extended far beyond sexuality to include advances in medicine, literature, and artistic expression. These texts were among the most widely traveled and influential books of their time. The economic impact of the medieval sex manual industry was substantial, with successful authors and publishers earning significant profits from the production and distribution of these specialized texts. The market for sexual education materials was large and lucrative enough to support a thriving publishing industry. The social influence of medieval sex manuals extended throughout court culture, with knowledge of sexual techniques becoming a mark of sophistication and social advancement. Nobles who were well-versed in sexual literature were considered more desirable marriage partners and more valuable political allies. The literary quality of medieval sex manuals was often remarkably high, with many texts combining practical instruction with poetic language, philosophical reflection, and artistic expression that elevated them beyond mere instructional material to the level of serious literature. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval sex manual production included advances in printing, illustration, and bookbinding that influenced the development of publishing throughout Europe. The demand for high-quality sex manuals drove innovations in book production that benefited the entire literary industry. The eternal performance of power as we stand today in the ruins of medieval castles, walking through chambers where kings and queens once performed their most intimate acts before audiences of hundreds, were confronted with the uncomfortable reality that one of history's most romanticized periods was built on the systematic transformation of human sexuality into public spectacle and political theater. Medieval courts didn't just happen to publicize sexuality, they deliberately and systematically destroyed the boundary between public and private, turning the most intimate human experiences into matters of state concern and political manipulation. This wasn't accidental exhibitionism but calculated policy that used sexual performance to demonstrate and maintain political power. The psychological impact of living in a society where sexuality was completely public must have been profound and traumatic. Medieval nobles grew up knowing that their most intimate moments would be witnessed, documented, and analyzed by hundreds of strangers who had political interests in their sexual performance. Privacy wasn't just unavailable, it was considered suspicious and potentially treasonous. Yet the medieval system also created opportunities for sexual expression and experimentation that challenged conventional boundaries in ways that were genuinely liberating for some participants. The courtly love tradition, the royal mistress system, and the elaborate sexual education industry all provided spaces for human desire that transcended simple reproduction and political alliance. The religious justification for public sexuality reveals the complex relationship between medieval Christianity and human desire. The Church simultaneously condemned sexual pleasure and created elaborate theological frameworks that justified sexual surveillance and control. This contradiction created a culture where sexuality was both sacred and sinful, both celebrated and condemned. The economic impact of medieval sexual culture was enormous, creating industries and markets that employed thousands of people and generated substantial wealth. From the royal mistress system to the sex manual industry, medieval sexuality was big business that affected the entire European economy. The international implications of medieval sexual politics shaped European history in ways that are still visible today. Royal marriages, papal annulments, and succession disputes that were fundamentally about sexuality determined the boundaries of nations and the fate of millions of people. The technological and medical advances that emerged from medieval sexual culture contributed to developments in medicine, law, and literature that influenced European civilization for centuries. The systematic study of human sexuality that medieval courts required led to advances in understanding that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. The social hierarchies that medieval sexual culture created and reinforced established patterns of gender relations, class distinction, and political authority that continued to influence European society long after the medieval period ended. The idea that sexuality was a legitimate tool of political control became embedded in Western culture in ways that are still visible today. The documentation that medieval courts produced about their sexual practices provides modern historians with unprecedented insight into the intimate lives of our ancestors. These records reveal not just what people did but how they thought about sexuality, privacy, and the relationship between personal desire and political power. The corruption and abuse that characterized much of medieval sexual culture serves as a warning about the dangers of eliminating privacy and turning intimate human experiences into matters of public concern. The medieval example demonstrates how easily sexual surveillance can become sexual exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval transformation of sexuality into public performance reveals how political systems can reshape the most fundamental aspects of human experience. The medieval courts didn't just control their subjects' political behavior, they controlled their most intimate thoughts and desires through systems of surveillance and performance that made resistance almost impossible. So tell us, which aspect of medieval sexual culture disturbs you most? The public consummation ceremonies, the systematic surveillance of royal pregnancies, or the way an entire civilization convinced itself that sexual privacy was dangerous to political stability? Share your thoughts below, and remember that understanding history's most invasive practices helps us recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time. If this journey into the bedchambers of medieval power has shocked and fascinated you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration of how political systems have used sexuality as a tool of control throughout history. Until then, remember that the stories we tell here at Scandalous Pasts are fictional tales that may or may not be inspired by real events, but the lessons they teach about the relationship between power and privacy are all too real. The stone walls of medieval castles still stand throughout Europe, their chambers echoing with the ghosts of performances that transformed human intimacy into political theater. They remind us that privacy is a precious and fragile thing, that the boundary between public and private is always under assault by those who seek power over others, and that the most intimate aspects of human experience are never safe from those who would exploit them for political gain. In their cold stone silence, we hear not just the echoes of medieval passion but the eternal warning that power corrupts everything it touches, even love itself.